He sat in his darkened room. He'd pulled the shutters together so only a thin ray of light was managing to get through. It traced a path across the space, illuminating the dust until it hit the surface of the book that had been placed on the table. The sunbeam highlighted the words embossed high onto the leather surface. Malleus Maleficarum, it read, the hammer of the witches. The book had become a standardized text in all schools in the 20 years since the incident, and now its ideology was firmly embedded in society. The man sat in the darkness, considering what he was about to do. He had done this before, but this time it was so much harder. He had eschewed an old-fashioned wide-brimmed hat and cloak of the 17th century. It was, he thought, too comical, like something out of fiction. He opted instead for a black suit, perfectly tailored to give him the air of gravitas his role required. He picked up the book and thumbed its pages pensively. He liked the way the leather felt in his hand, the heavy paper it was printed on. It gave him comfort that he was doing the right thing. This had all started just around a month ago. He still remembered the day far too well. If he could go back and change the past, he would. He would never have sent her to school that day. He would have done what he could to protect her. It was a bright April morning. The weather, he remembered, had been much milder than expected for that time of year. No clouds and bright sunlight. He had made her a packed lunch of cheese sandwiches, an apple, and a little pot of strawberry yogurt. It was funny how he remembered all the little details. Strawberry was her favourite. It had been since she was a baby. It made him laugh as she always complained that she didn't need a packed lunch anymore now that she was 18 and in college. It was just him and Martha. They had lost her mother, his wife, almost 4 years ago, to the big sea. He still saw his wife in his daughter's eyes every time she looked at him. Both of them had the most unusually vivid green eyes, though his daughter's eyes always had just the tiniest hint of sadness since they had returned together from the hospital that day. Martha still took the lunch though. She did every day, beaming at her father as she ran out of the house to catch the school bus. She always tried to convince him everything was okay with that smile. He should have sat her down, found out what she was going through. Maybe he could have prevented this. School for Martha had been getting increasingly hard. It had been since her mother died. Her grades had been slipping consistently, meaning she had gone from the top of her classes to a less than average student. The first thing she did every morning was bin the awful packed lunch her father had made her. She hated cheese, and strawberry yogurt was just disgusting. She never told her father. She didn't want to hurt his feelings, and he was always so engrossed in his work. She knew what he did. She knew that he was the most successful witchfinder and prosecutor in the region. Up until recently, she had considered this a badge of honour, to be Mr. Archibald Tyler's daughter. That was until she had begun to feel strange. It had begun at around the same time her mother had passed, maybe a month or so after. She had begun to notice an odd feeling of energy coursing through her veins. At first, she couldn't put her finger on it. It was a strange tingling in the ends of her fingers. She would have described it as the same feeling you have when you put your fingers in very hot water for just a little too long. Initially, she tried to ignore it, putting it down to sleeping funny or bad circulation. But the feelings grew until her whole body tingled with nervous energy. It felt more and more and more like static was building up inside her. That's when things started to happen that she could not explain. The first thing that she noticed was when the previously friendly golden retriever across the road began to snarl and growl at her. That was just strange. She had dismissed it though. Maybe it was older than she thought it was and was going a bit senile. The next thing she remembered was a black cat had begun to hang around the house, and in particular, outside her window. It used to sit in the low branches of the oak tree and cry all night as she tried to sleep. Then, there were the unexplained breakages. She would be doing the dishes or making lunch, and a glass or plate would fall off the shelf behind her. She had hoped her father hadn't noticed the odd things. Martha was fortunate that more often than not, his head was buried in that book, or reading the newspaper. He always liked to focus on the reports of the witches that had been brought to trial and executed. Most of the time, a trial wasn't needed either. The courts had a prima facie case, based on first-hand accounts, and with the proliferation of social media, lots of video evidence too. This was enough for automatic prosecution and conviction at the hands of the local witchfinder. Martha's father had been a witchfinder for 10 years. He had volunteered on the first day of the law coming into force. It was his calling, he said. She had of course believed him. She wanted her father to do well. But now she was afraid of his wrath. She had concentrated hard to suppress the sensations and control the odd things that were happening around her, hoping to will them away. She was less than successful. The more she fought it, the worse it got, and she became increasingly ill. It was as if they were fighting to get out of her. Classes were boring as usual. She had been paying less and less attention, and in sociology, as they were studying the malleus for the billionth time, she had drifted off into a daydream. That's when it happened. Mr. Williams had hurled a board rubber at her head, except this time, it didn't hit her. It stopped in midair, hovering, held by some strange force, in the centre of the classroom. Mr. Williams's face changed instantly, from disgust through hatred to fear, as he studied the possibilities in front of him. He didn't have to wait long. He was going to run, but the board rubber flew back at him with such force that it knocked him unconscious. Martha leapt to her feet. Some people said she flew, and let out a scream so loud that the other students, the ones who hadn't run out of the room in fear, covered their ears. They should have covered their eyes, as glass blew out from everywhere, razor-sharp shards blinding them as they raced to the doors. She swept her hand in front of her and desks flew against the wall. Everything she had pent up was released in that instant. A force of will like nothing ever recorded. Gossip about the incident was quick to sweep the country. They say the witch killed anywhere between 25 and 100 students and 2 teachers to an entire faculty that day. They say that it took a platoon of anti-witch SWAT with salt rounds to bring her down. They say a lot of things. Sometimes the fear is less scary than the truth. The truth is somewhat less dramatic. 3 students and only 1 teacher died in the rain of glass. The standoff against the SWAT unit had ended in Martha tearfully handing herself over to her father. He'd gone to embrace and comfort her at first, but the officers had reminded him of his duty. His ashen face as he put the warded cuffs on her stuck in everyone's memory that saw that day. They were sworn to secrecy along with all the officers and officials in attendance, a witchfinder fathering a witch. This incident could hurt the regime, so the propaganda machine had whirled into force. They had covered up the incident, describing her as a lone terrorist, threatening all the other students and teachers with summary judgment as they had rendered her to the facility. As for her father, there was only one way he was going to prove his loyalty. He was going to prosecute and execute his daughter. He couldn't see the clock in his office. He only knew it was time when the knuckles rapped on the door 3 times. Out of habit, he checked his watch. "I'm coming, Sergeant." He coughed and stood up, picked up his copy of the malleus and his court papers. He could do this. He had to do this. It was his duty. The officer that had come to fetch him was in the grey fatigues that all the guards wore in the central court and prison. His mop of dark brown hair was mostly hidden under his standard issue cap. He didn't meet the witchfinder's gaze. It was refreshingly anonymous. The last thing that Archibald wanted now was someone to strike up a conversation. He pulled his office door closed and spoke just once on the walk to the quadrant. "Let's get this over with." His voice was flat, not an intonation of joy, sadness, or anything that would give away how conflicted he was feeling right now. Central Court Complex was a maze of identical featureless corridors. Some people said that this was done deliberately to disorientate you. Archibald knew this was true. They wanted you to feel on edge. They were watching. He kept thinking, weighing up his decision. He was going to do this. After all, if he didn't, it would be her, then him. It was self-preservation. The walk to the central quadrant, where they prosecuted and executed the witches, probably took about 10 minutes. But today, his polished black brogues felt heavy. It felt like a route march, and he was sweating too. The sergeant looked at him briefly now and again, but decided not to mention anything, which was probably for the best. The Witchfinder would have immediately had his badge today. The sun had disappeared behind some clouds. That was the first thing that struck Archibald as the big metal door to the courtyard opened. He looked up, around at the lines of armed soldiers, anywhere but to the centre of the courtyard. He didn't want to see it, to believe it until the last minute. He held off looking up for as long as possible until he was at his presiding station, a little wooden pulpit with a little platform for his papers and a microphone so the accused and the gathered witnesses could hear his proclamations. He stalled, still shuffling his papers. Then he looked up. At the very centre of the courtyard stood a metal platform, around 12 feet square. In the centre, there was another platform raised up about 6 feet into the air. This made sure everyone had a good view. The floor had been neatly stacked around with kindling, so there was no visible gap between the two platforms. On the raised platform, there was enough room for 2 people. There was the guard in the grey fatigues, and standing shackled to the floor and with her hands firmly cuffed behind a metal pole was what appeared to be a girl, around 18 years old, in a white cotton smock which covered her completely except for the black burlap hood which covered her face. Archibald closed his eyes, tapped the microphone, gulped, and began. "Remove the accused hood. She has the right to see her accuser." The guard took the hood off and disappeared down a hidden set of metal steps at the back of the platform. The girl blinked. She looked underfed, her head completely shaved. "Dad, it's me, Martha. You can't let them. I couldn't help it." Archibald didn't look up. It was hard enough already. "Martha May Tylus." He paused. That was it. He'd started now. He could hear her wailing through her tears. "You stand charged with malfeasance, contrary to common law as laid down in the Witchcraft Act of 2050. He paused. "On 4 counts of murder by the way of witchcraft. Each is punishable by summary execution. How do you plead?" "Father! Look at me! I'm your daughter! It's Martha!" He looked up, shook his head and continued. Only the closest observer would have noticed the tear in his eye. He was fortunate the 2 pulpit guards had their backs turned to him. "How do you plead?" he stammered. There was a lump in his throat. "Stop it, Dad! You won't let them kill me! You can't! Please! For Mum!" she sobbed. It wasn't them who had to press the red button to start the gas burners. It was him. His breathing was noticeably deeper now. He was trying to steady himself. "The accused has not entered a plea. We shall proceed immediately to the sentence." His hand turned the gas key that unlocked the valves and started the flow of gas upwards. Martha sniffed. Her nose was blocked from the tears, but was sure she couldn't smell anything. "For each count you are found guilty and hereby sentenced to death by burning." He heard a scream as he pressed the button, so loud it nearly deafened the crowd. Screams were normal. Explosions weren't. There was chaos and confusion and lots of shouting and pointing. Something had gone horribly wrong, or very right, depending on your point of view. Most of the initial explosions had come from the gates as they had been blown inwards. The really clever thing was setting the bomb to trigger when he tried to start the gas burners. That blew apart the pulpit and sent the guards running for shelter. They had made sure to include an incendiary device for a little added touch. Archibald had expected flames, but they should be around her, not him and the guards. The agony as his flesh burnt from his bones was indescribable. So this was how 152 women had felt. Vengeance was a woman scorned. The resistance to the regime had been growing day by day, and now they struck at its very heart. The last thing he saw, as he lay dying in agony on the floor, was a bald-headed girl and woman running off into a waiting van. The strange thing was, he could have sworn they had the very same vivid green eyes.